Hello, I'm Michael Ekstrand, Boise State University People and Information Research Team, and yesterday in the first two PPF talks, we heard about the need for recommender systems to advance user goals. We heard one particular mechanism for doing that to help people achieve self-actualization through the recommender system. We just heard about recommender systems needing to help people advance their lives, and today, I'm going to present our thoughts, Martijn, Willemsen at Eindhoven University of Technology and myself, on how to engage users in figuring out what those goals are and what kind of a life we should be helping them get to. The too long didn't read of this talk, even though it's a short talk, is listen to your users, at least sometimes. So in recommender systems, we have broadly two different ways of collecting input for our recommender systems and for evaluating whether they work. We can look at what users do, a very behavioristic approach that observes behavior and uses that as input and as evaluation, and we can listen to what they say. Looking at what they do commonly comes up in implicit feedback as well as behavioral A/B testing. We give users recommendations. We see what they click. We see what they watch. We listen to what they say. We're looking at explicit feedback. We're looking at user surveys. We're looking at focus groups, that kind of thing. And so, in some ways, and there's very good reasons why there's been the focus on implicit feedback. The data is much more readily available, for one thing. And Xavier and Justin talked about a number of those reasons. Our contention is that there are good reasons to go beyond explicit feedback. One thing that particularly comes up is when these two things disagree, what do we do? Oftentimes, what we do is we ignore what the users say. We recommend based on what they do. That's going to generate, in at least the short term, that's probably going to generate more revenue. But we believe that there's a lot of room for a lot of interesting research on novel ways to listen to what users say and involve them in all aspects of the recommendation process. Why? We're going to talk about two families of reasons. One is pragmatic, the kinds of applications that we can build if we engage users in the process of designing recommendations, providing input, and evaluating those recommenders. And then some philosophical reasons about why engaging users in the process can be an intrinsically good thing. First, I do want to clarify a little bit of what we are not saying. We are not saying just listen to what users say and do every feature they request and design your products by user voice mob rule. That would be a really bad idea. Also, we're not saying ignore behavioral data or give up on A/B testing or bandits or anything like that. What we're saying is that we should set recommendation on a three-legged stool. There's a lot of expertise in this room about how to build recommender systems and develop compelling recommendation experiences. Use that. Use the behavioral data, understand how people are engaging with your system, to understand how that advances your business goals, et cetera. But involve user input to understand what it is that users want from your system, what it is that they want from your life that the system may or may not be helping them get to. So to get into the pragmatic reasons, in RecSys 14, Neil Hupp from Netflix gave a keynote. And one of the things that stuck out at me in that keynote was he commented that the metrics that Netflix was using, at least at the time, to optimize the algorithms, looking at what people click, they can't distinguish between someone having an enriched life because they're watching movies and TV shows that make them a better and a happier person, and someone being addicted to Netflix. And I think most of us would probably agree that we would prefer our systems to be enriching people's lives than feeding addiction. So how do we break this cycle? There's also as I said, sometimes these the implicit feedback, the explicit feedback, they disagree. In psychology, this is called, well, one dynamic that can be producing this is the intention-behavior gap. Users say one thing, do another. This is a really old problem. Back in the 1st century, Paul said, what I want to do, I don't do, and what I don't want to do, I do. So he's got this distinction between what he wants to do and what he's doing. There's two reasons this can arise, at least. One, users don't truly understand what they want. They're bad at telling us what they want. But the other one is that they're not satisfied with our desires. And one thing that we want you to take away from this is that there's a lot of value for users in being able to use recommendations to help bridge the gap in that second point. How do we help users bring their behavior in alignment with the desires and the goals that they have for their lives? We first need to know which is true, which is a hard problem. Then once we do, if we know this case, if we know the user's goals and their behavior, we combine this explicit engagement with the user to figure out what it is that they want. Maybe they want to be watching more historical documentaries, and they're watching a bunch of silly road trip or whatever college comedies. The recommender can help. The recommender, when it looks at people's behavior, we're really good at recommending things that they're going to do based on their behavior. If we can get their goals as kind of this reference point, the recommender could actually be a really powerful tool in helping the user get from where they're at now, because we're good at doing this behavior matching, to where they want to be by jointly optimizing for they'll do it, and it's going to take them closer to their goals. So we can find baby steps that are likely to be adopted. Users' behavior is crucial here. And that's closer to the user's goals. And we can come up with goals for some kinds of systems, but we can also engage the user explicitly in finding that themselves. Also, persuasive computing has done a lot of work on how we can persuade people to do things. But what the recommender can do is it can figure out what to try to persuade them to do that will help them get where they want to go. So for an example, if I'm here and I do biking, I bike down the Greenbelt, down the block, maybe I commute, and I want to get to the point where I'm doing long-distance endurance cycling, like the 1,200-kilometer randonnée in Colorado. How do I get there? We need to know the goal, but then once we want to know how I get there, maybe we can recommend a 40-mile ride out to Lucky Peak and back. And then the half century in Boise, there's start moving up, we can go to a century, we can take some longer unsupported rides, maybe at some point do the Triple H down in Texas, which is a 100-mile ride in Central Texas in August. There's a psychological tool that lets us do this. It's called the rosh scale, which orders activities from easy to hard, and it lets us model where users are on that scale. So we can take where the user is now, and we can produce a sequence of recommendations that moves them up the scale. That we can do with the behavior, that we can do with the psychological model. What we need, though, where we need the user input, is we need to know where to point the scale. It's a great tool, but unless we know where to point it, what the end goal is going to be, it's going to be hard in order to use it to produce a compelling recommendation experience that's going to help the user achieve the goals that they have for their life. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some philosophical reasons for doing this. Giving users a voice. So a year or two ago, and when Twitter, it was about a year ago, when Twitter was rolling out their algorithmic feed, I'm picking on Twitter a little bit here. I do love Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter, you can probably see that. But there are many good reasons to involve filtering in Twitter. There are many times I want an algorithmic feed to help me catch up on old tweets and things like that. But it changes the dynamic of the service. And one of the complaints that came about on it is that a number of users, particularly users who are heavily invested in the service and were the kinds of users that brought Twitter to initial fame and popularity, felt like their voice wasn't being heard in the decision process and that their needs were being completely ignored. Participatory design provides a framework for incorporating user voices into how we design our systems, how we determine our system values, and things like that. Transparent, that's not enough alone, though, because you can involve some users, and if nobody knows you're involving users other than the 50 you talked to, nobody knows what's going on. Transparency of what's going on and some transparency about how you arrived at the decision can then show users that user voices are being included. Also, in Ursula Franklin's work, The Real World of Technology, she talks about the concept of reciprocity. And reciprocity is a value where in one-on-one human interactions, there's reciprocity. There's a give and take as you learn each other's voices, as you communicate ideas and exchange ideas. And she was concerned in '89 about the technological aspect of many of our technologies became broadcast. So one person sent a message and there was no feedback. There was no reciprocity and give and take around the messages that were being delivered, around the way that technology was designed. And effectively argues reciprocity is an intrinsic good for for systems that are going to mediate between people. I think recommender systems can provide an opportunity to bring some reciprocity back by taking with users' actions, taking the users' feedback into account in the kind of experience they're finally delivered. But we need to think seriously about how to do that. There's also the question of whose values is the system built for. There are many stakeholders in a recommender system. There's the company shareholders, there's the management, there's the developers that are building the system, there's the users. Whose values and what values are embedded in the system, and just looking at behavior is not going to tell you the user's values. It's a really noisy behavior reflects values and a whole pile of other things that it's really hard to tease out those confounds in order to actually get at what do the users want from the systems that we are building. Also, the user study kinds of things are very good at getting at some things, but asking the users if they have a particular value and whether the recommendation reflects it, but it's not very good at eliciting what values the users have that we may not have thought about. Figuring out how to do that's a nice open problem. So to get back to a little bit of pragmatics of the values, if users are effectively co-creators of the technology, co-creators of the recommendations through the explicit feedback process, and of the technology itself through involvement in the design process, could it combat some of the PR problems surrounding things around the filter bubble? Because whether or not the filter bubble is real, the filter bubble causing people to be concerned about recommender systems is real. Can it help with that? Can it increase user satisfaction or increase user adoption of recommendations if they feel like the recommendation somehow came from their engagement? And I don't have time to go in detail on this slide, but I have in the slides that are online, I've tweeted them, I'll tweet them again. You can see the various points in which we can introduce recommendations. A few challenges to make this possible. How can we scale participatory design? Participatory design is typically a few people in a room. What does that even look like at web scale? What does it even look like with algorithmic systems that users can't understand what all is going on inside? How can we use the intention behavior gap, et cetera? And with this, hopefully, we can get compelling new applications and maintain user agency in the system so that they're not giving up their agency. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Michael. Questions? There are some.
Peter Brusilovsky, University of Pisa. Exciting talk. Thank you very much, and really well presented. Now I get a concern. We just learned from another exciting talk from industry that finally we figured out what recommender systems are about, learning to rank, and feature engineering. And now completely different prospects. How to tie it together, industry prospect, which is great presentation, just like 2 talks ago, and yours. We're happy about that, greater good, universities, but industry, how we can get all of this trickling down to industry? Is there any chance, or just like good wishes for us in academia?
That is a really, really good question, and I would love to have a more extended conversation about that throughout our talking time in the conference. Part of it is building interesting tools. So one place that could have an interesting place to do this is applications like Strava. Strava picks up a lot of your data about, say, your athletic activity. That might be the first kind of place to start applying some of these ideas. If you could engage users in a conversation about what their goals are on Strava, and then recommend routes that can help them extend their ability. That could be a first step before we then start maybe seeing it trickling down into more things. It would be fantastic to have a widget in Netflix that lets me say, I would want to watch more stuff like that, help me recommend me to get there. And maybe it says, oh, it's Friday night, and you usually watch some cheesy comedy or something, but so it's going to put the first thing at the recommendation list, something that's a step from the cheesy comedy to the thing I really want to kind of nudge me in the direction of adhering to my goals. I'd love to be able to do that with Netflix in the system. No idea if they'd be interested in building such a tool, but I think that places like Strava kinds of applications might be the first place we can see that happen.
So, Joe Constand, University of Minnesota. On the one hand, it's hard to argue with anything you say, and on the other hand, I'm going to try anyway. I think you're pushing the pendulum back, which is good. You know, the field started explicit, it's pushed all the way to implicit, and pushing it back is good. But I worry you're pushing it too far. And to continue the religious quotes, I'm sort of reminded of the story of the 4 sons. You have the wise one who you just talk with, and then you have the one who doesn't know to ask. And I worry that many of the users we're dealing with don't have a goal of where they're trying to get, that they're aware of and could articulate. And you can imagine the person who doesn't even know they're ready to start a diet, but you've noticed that they suddenly started looking at nutritional informations. And if the system waits for them to tell you explicitly, it's not going to work. And that, in fact, the answer is probably not at either end of the pendulum, that sometimes the system needs to say, gee, if this person is looking at this information, maybe we need to start nudging. And sometimes the system needs to say, wow, we've nudged and we're getting there. Maybe it's time to re-engage and ask the person explicitly. But if you start by taking the person who's not ready for change based on behavior change theory and ask them to articulate a goal, you're probably too early. And that in many cases where we have real power in recommender systems is that we can suggest things that help them discover their goal before they're ready to commit to it.
That's a very good point, and an interesting model of being able to detect that the user might be ready, maybe do the nudge, and then maybe at some point the nudge is to engage them more deeply. And I don't think that it would be a good at all to build a recommender system so that in order to get recommendations, you first have to engage in this lengthy participatory design interview process. That's really going to cut down on our user base a lot. I think that one model I have in my mind of what it can look like is basically have it there as a visible option, because deciding whether or not to participate in the process is itself an act of agency. If you don't have the option to participate in the process, you don't have the agency to do so, but if the option is there and you decline to use it, you've maintained user agency, so the philosophical things are satisfied. And then figuring out those users and figuring out, oh, you're like this other, maybe they're somewhat like this other user who did participate in an explicit feedback process and went there, maybe we want to send you that direction, or in something that has a social recommendation component as well, maybe even recommend that you connect with that person.
Michael, one more short question on the right, if we could have a short answer.
I'm going to try to make it short, because as Peter said, we could start like a very long discussion between industry and academia on this. But one specific thing, you seem to be saying that when there's a disagreement between explicit and implicit feedback, it's because users don't understand themselves or don't understand the system. There's a very well-known effect that actually users want to portray themselves as being different, right? And this is known before recommender systems. People, you would ask them on a survey and they all say they watch documentaries, but then the reality is they don't. So how do you deal with this sort of like issue of users wanting to portray themselves as something that they're not, and it's very aspirational?
So that's a very good question. And I think that is an interesting additional dynamic, because we've got, do they not understand? Are they dissatisfied with their behavior? But then we can kind of think of that as a degree of dissatisfaction. Do they want to present themselves a particular way, or how much do they want to be the person they present themselves as being? I don't know how to find out. That's probably a better question for the psychologist, but I think figuring out where they are between I like to be this person but be seen as someone else, and I want to be the person I'm seen as, is a really interesting question.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to all the speakers in today's session and all of the PPF speakers.